A good quality eyeshadow should be easy to apply, have great color payoff, and avoid creasing in the eyelid area. So today, Allure is giving me some mystery eyeshadows and challenging me to guess which ones are most expensive. So eyeshadow A definitely has what we call specialty pigments. Specialty pigments are those that do things beyond just offering like a base color and coverage. They could be iridescent or duochrome, having two different shades. They can have a color shift, and that usually means more expensive because specialty pigments can easily go up to be like $700 a kilogram. In this case, this glitter has a almost peachy pink to violet blue color shift to it. And eyeshadow B also has some specialty pigments, but they seem to be larger particle in that it's in the glitter itself, like the plastic, and not any sheer or mica pigments that are also in the shadow with it. Glitter eyeshadows should have a hexagonal shape if you look at it under a microscope. If it's circular or even square, that can cut into the eye, which is why you shouldn't use craft glitter on your face because that one is not hexagonal shape. So as I'm zooming in on A, I see very few hexagonal shapes. So it looks like most of this shadow is made up of micas or some maybe silica. And mica and silica, of course, they're minerals. And in this case, the minerals aren't like uniformly shaped because you see all these tiny particles that are kind of jagged, but you can occasionally see a hexagonal shape that's bigger and that's kind of pink in color. So that lets me know that that is in fact the glitter particle, but there's not much of it. I don't think that's a high priced eyeshadow because if you're paying for a glitter shadow, you want glitter. And for sample B, I'm definitely seeing more of the hexagonal shapes. In this case, the color is blue. And notice that the silicas, the silicates, the micas, like the smaller particle shapes are a little bit more uniform and smoother on the edges, less jagged. This seems to be like the higher quality, higher priced option because you have way more glitter particles that are visible. Glitter eyeshadows typically are made from plastic glitters. Plastic naturally does not stick to skin well, so it has to have good adhesion. And it also has to be free from irritation because oftentimes glitter eyeshadows are made with film formers that are dissolved in alcohol or other solvents that can be irritating to the eye. Product A. Initial thoughts, kind of patchy. And in terms of the texture, it applied fine. I'm noticing a slight warming sensation, so there's probably some film formers in here. The purpose of the film former is to prevent the glitter from flaking off. Because it's such a large particle, it has a hard time staying on the eyelid. Now we're going to apply eyeshadow B. This one definitely has a bit more coverage, and you can definitely see more of the larger glitter particles. And the other thing to look out for with glitter shadows is that they can tend to clump because of the larger particle. So I'm trying to see how easy it is to break up those clumps with the brush. So after the visual analysis and the application, I feel like sample B is the higher quality and more expensive shadow because as you can see, it offers significantly more coverage. It was more comfortable on the eye, and also this was easier to blend. Let's look at some prices. Starting with A. Oh wow, $4.99. That's a pretty good price for the shadow. And B, $25. B is the winner. Going off of the ingredient list, it's clear that there was like less glitter in sample A versus sample B because the second ingredient in sample A is calcium aluminum borosilicate. The borosilicates were those jagged, varied shaped, smaller particles that we were looking at versus the third ingredient, which is the actual plastic glitter. And we compare that to sample B. The second ingredient is the glitter itself, polyethylene terephthalate in this case. And the third ingredient in sample B are the borosilicate particles. The differentiating factor between a powdered metallic and a standard glitter is the particle size. Powdered metallics are typically made of finely milled mica or borosilicate or some mineral that gives you that nice, even, smooth coverage while still having a metallic sheen to it. Initial impression, A is chunkier and almost has like a glazing effect. Glazing is when you have a large amount of oil pulling up from the shadow itself. We typically try to avoid glazing regardless of how much you're spending on the eyeshadow, but it does happen, especially in lower priced shadows. Shadow B has a more uniform texture to it. The main things to look for in a powdered metallic eyeshadow is how well it blends and avoid creasing in the eyelid area. Shadow A, in terms of picking up on the brush, it kind of like broke apart a little bit, which lets me know it's not going to be the smoothest application. Kind of applies almost like glitter where there are some specks that fall out. Like half of it fell off of the brush, but once I blended it out, it came out more even and uniform, but still kind of sheer. And now for Shadow B, this one sticks to the brush a lot better. Oh yeah, that's definitely more pigmented and it goes on much smoother. So far I think Shadow B is the higher quality item because it had an easier application and it had more coverage. Now we're going to do what's called an oil test. Basically, we're going to take a skin-like oil, in this case a jojoba oil, and apply it to my wrist and then apply the shadow on top. This is to see how well and how likely the shadow is to crease. And because these are metallics and are already made with mica, mica is a really great oil absorbing agent. I'm trying to recreate an oily eyelid in an area that creases really easily. And now I'm just flexing my wrist back and forth just to see if I see any like creasing or bunching in the center. So far, I'm pretty good. There is some slight creasing in this divot here. Okay, now for eyeshadow B. And I notice when I'm picking it up with my hand, it has a very dry texture to it. I'm not noticing much creasing here except a slight line right there, but it's barely visible. I'm not really feeling either of these shadows in terms of application because they both were kind of dry and crumbly upon just touching it with your finger, and they both kind of bunched in the eyelid a little bit when blending it out. So I think B is the winner here, but by a very narrow margin. It applied better, it still had better coverage. Also, Shadow B did not have as much creasing compared to Shadow A when performing the oil test. And now for the big reveal. Shadow A, $10, not bad. And Shadow B, this is not worth $32. It is the winner, it is like the higher quality, higher priced item, but because it bunches and how dry it was, no. I would rather have Shadow A in this case because you're getting the full price that you're paying for versus this should be a lot smoother, more luxurious in terms of how you apply it. All right, looking at the ingredients, sample A is mica based and so is sample B, but sample B uses synthetic mica called synthetic fluoroflagopite. That's worthy of note because synthetic mica tends to be more expensive because it's created in a lab versus natural mica that's mined, and oftentimes it has an unethical source. So if you want something ethical, you should have to pay more for it because it's fair labor practices. So that does justify the price a little bit more, but you can definitely get synthetic fluoroflagopite for less than $32. Matte eyeshadows are matte because they're mainly made of pure pigment. The mattes are pretty neon, which lets me know it has a type of pigment called lake pigments. Lake pigments are usually 30% dyes. Dyes stain, pigments cover, which is why sometimes you have eyeshadows that stain your eyelids. Palette B also has some bright colors, but they're not quite as neon. And this one actually has a red. That's interesting because it's kind of hard to get a nice full coverage red for eye makeup. That's because you're limited in the pigments. If it's iron oxides, the mineral pigments, they're not very bright, but you get coverage from them. However, if it's red 40, it tends to be sheer and it always tends to pull orange. Or you could use carmine, which is a nice purplish red, but isn't vegan. For the purposes of assessing the coverage, I'm only focusing on these two shades just because the red and the orange tend to be harder to get full coverage. And the purpose of matte is for it to be a nice, solid, flat color. So that's the main quality we're gonna be evaluating in terms of which one is the higher priced item. Shadow A. I'm going in with a narrow brush to pack that pigment on. So this color on my skin is more on the sheer side, but still a nice, pretty color, and it blends pretty easily. So this color, while pretty, isn't nearly as vibrant as I expected it to be because in the actual palette, it's super bright and neon and bold, but on my skin, it's kind of subdued. And that's something to note because a lot of times when they're formulating shadows, they don't consider a wide variation of skin tones when they're determining how well it should blend and look on the skin. All right, now let's apply Shadow B. I'm not really impressed with either of these colors. Again, they both have a soft pastel look to it, but they're not neon. I'm putting on my lab coat because we're about to do a very messy test. What I'm looking for is how likely it is to bleed into the alcohol and how much is left at the bottom as sediments. If there is a high concentration of color in the solution, that lets me know that there is a high concentration of lake pigments. And a higher concentration of the lake pigments usually means a more expensive palette. Solely going off of initial impressions, A definitely has some lake pigments because it's starting to stain the alcohol solution almost immediately. Whereas B has a slight tint, but it's not concentrated. But we're gonna let both of these sit for 2 hours to give it time for the lake to bleed into the solution of alcohol. So looking at sample A, there is a high concentration of dye in this solution. As you can see, like there's very little sediment at the bottom, which lets me know that this one is definitely made from some lake dyes and probably a large amount of it. It might be a higher price eyeshadow because lake pigments tend to be more expensive than other types of pigments. Now looking at eyeshadow B, there is far more sediment at the bottom and the color in the solution is not as concentrated. So this might have lake pigments, but not as much as sample A. So this one is tough because neither of them had the coverage I was expecting. They both had similar application. Shadow A has more lake pigments in it. So off of that alone, I'm gonna say eyeshadow A is the higher priced one. This one is, wow, $49. And this one, $20. Okay, that makes sense. Neither of these lived up to my expectations, but because this one has some bright neon colors, that explains why it's more expensive. I don't like that they weren't really inclusive in terms of the payoff for darker skin tones, and that happens a lot in labs because if the lab doesn't have any dark skinned individuals, there's no way for them to test it because they really rely on the contract manufacturer or the chemist to do the testing. And if the chemist is one shade, that's all the shadow is being based off of. Let's look at the ingredients. So looking at sample A, I was right, there are definitely lake pigments in this color. As you can see, there's carmine, red 6, red 28, red 7 lake, red 30 lake, red 40 lake, yellow 5 lake, yellow 6 lake. Yeah, this is a bright palette. Sample B, on the other hand, only has yellow 5 lake, red 40 lake, and blue 1 lake. Liquid eyeshadows can typically be broken up into either water-based or oil-based. The water-based ones tend to dry or set faster, producing a transfer-resistant film on the skin, but they also tend to be a little bit more irritating because you have to add extra preservatives to account for microbes that might grow in the water. Things that are anhydrous or water-free don't typically need preservatives, like lip balms and lipsticks are often made without any preservation system whatsoever because microbes can't grow in an environment that's absent of moisture. So Shadow A seems to have like a mica-based, kind of like metallic sheen to it. And it also tends to be more of an attribute for water-based formulation than oil-based that uses pure pigments. And Shadow B also has some glitter mica particles in it. So I'm thinking that these are both water-based formulations, just going off of how it looks in the container itself. And as far as color, this is the more interesting combination because it has a reflection to it where you have this purple color, but it has a golden reflectance, making it a specialty pigment, and specialty pigments are more expensive to produce. Versus Shadow A that has more of a solid tone. It still has some slight reflection, but so far it's not as interesting visually. Now let's apply Shadow A. I'm looking to see if there's any burning or irritation from the preservative system. And there is some slight irritation. The color is nice. Again, not interesting, but it is still a nice solid color. As far as dry down time, it's important that your liquid eyeshadow doesn't dry too quickly because you don't have time to blend it with other colors, or if you want to do a smoky eye look and add something on top, if it sets too quickly, then it won't budge and blend in and mix in with other shadow. This one has a really moderate dry down time. I can still feel it's wet on the skin, so that's great in terms of adding other colors on top if I wanted to. Now for Shadow B. This one also has some good coverage. It's not as irritating as Shadow A, and the dry down time seems to be pretty good because I'm able to go back over areas to make sure it's fully blended and everything is properly covered. It also seems to be more opaque. It's definitely shinier in terms of the sheen. There's more light bouncing off of the eyelid. Shadow B has the more interesting color, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the higher quality or higher price. That could just be the color option. All right, now I'm going to soak a cotton round in water and then wipe it. If they're water-based, it'll melt as soon as the water touches it. But if it's oil-based, it'll kind of bead up on top. Shadow A, yeah. A good chunk came off. Now for Shadow B. Oh yeah, that one's definitely water-based. If you're looking for a shadow that's easy to remove at the end of the day, you should go with a water-based liquid shadow. If you're looking for a more water-resistant shadow, you should make sure that it's an oil-based formula. Using something like isododecane is the first ingredient. The other downside to a water-based formula is if you're combining it with other makeup items like concealer on your eyelid. Most concealers are oil-based, so it may not pair well with water-based shadow on top of it. And I'll say for this category, it was kind of hard to determine which one is more expensive because they both had similar coverage, they had similar dry down time, similar application. So based off of all the tests, I feel like Shadow A is the more expensive shadow because it had a little bit of water resistance, whereas the other one came completely off, which makes me think the only solvent in Shadow B is water. However, in terms of color, I prefer B, but let's look at some prices. Shadow A is $36. And Shadow B, $25. Isn't surprising. They're both in that mid-tier, almost luxury price category. And as you go beyond $40 and $50, you get in that luxury tier where you're expecting more of a aesthetic and sensorial difference in application. All right, now let's take a look at the ingredient list to see if these are both in fact water-based liquid shadows. So sample B is 100% water-based. There's not really any oil-based ingredient in this formula. The first ingredient, of course, is water. Whereas Shadow A is kind of interesting. It's like what we call an emulsion, a combination of oil and water. In this case, we have water and then we have the isododecane I mentioned earlier. And this kind of makes sense because when I added water to the cotton round and swiped it, only a fraction of it came off instead of it completely coming off and completely staying put, which lets me know it's more likely a combination of oil and water. As I mentioned before, they both had similar coverage and application, so the fact that they're kind of close in pricing isn't surprising.